Good afternoon, everyone, from Lolo, Montana. This is an early November Sunday afternoon, and I am very excited to introduce you to Larry Mensch. He is an attorney. He is a professor at the University of Montana, and you are also a head of the Montana Innocence Project. Is that not correct?
That's right.
Yeah. Could you give us a little bit of your background and independent of the reason that we're here, of course, is for one of our learning adventures on the great criminal trial that was involved the Farmer's Almanac and Abe Lincoln. But before we get into that, let's hear a little something about you.
Sure.
Okay. You're a history buff.
I'm a history person. Yep, that's right. I like history. I'm originally from the Midwest. Excuse my cough, a little bit of a cold. I'm fighting it off.
That's okay.
But I went to school in Minnesota and then Nebraska, and have lived in Montana since 1984. And my wife's from Missoula. Our kids were born here in Missoula. And I started my legal career out in Glendive, working for Judge McDonough for a couple of years as a clerk, and then began a public defender work for about 20 years. Then was in private practice for a while, and then took a break from law and got my master's in education from the University of Montana, and taught history for about 10 years here in Missoula.
Really?
Right, and then worked in the National Guard as a JAG for 20 years, and then when the chance to go to work for the Montana Innocence Project 10 years ago came up, I got on board there, and we've had a good run with the Innocence Project. And every once in a while, I like to get back in the classroom and teach at the university or for Molly classes. That's how we met.
That's exactly how we met. And for those of you who don't understand what Molly stands for, it's the Osher Lifelong Learning.
Right.
And it's learning for the fun of it.
It is.
And it's for people 50 years or older. And Larry did this really fabulous class that both my husband and I took a year ago right now, I think it was. And the whole time I was sitting there, I was thinking, gosh, I just know that my members on Days at Dunrovi would really enjoy this class. So, you know me, I'm really shy. I just tackled him on the way out the door. And he was, stupid enough to come on out to Dunrovi. And we had some nice wine on the back deck and met your wife. She's terrific. She passed out cookies the last day of class, I have to add.
That's right.
This is as only you would have in Montana,
That's
I have to say. She was wonderful. Anyway, I hope we become friends over this and that you stay around.
I'm happy to be here. As long as we talk about history, I'm happy.
Well, when I went to Larry's office to get a little more information, he had all this baseball paraphernalia. And haven't you written a book about? Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, my first book I wrote, I think, in 98 or 99. Started off as a magazine article. There's an old-time baseball player whose name was Rube Marquard. He played at the early days of the century, 100 years ago. And he was a terrific pitcher and set the record for 19 wins in a row and pitched in the World Series and no-hitters and everything. But in the off-season, when he wasn't playing for the New York Giants, he was a vaudeville star.
Oh, wow.
And so he married a vaudeville singer, and they toured the country. They came to Montana, in fact, in 1912 and 13 and 14. So he had kind of a dual career in baseball and show business, and he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I wrote a book about him, and it did pretty well, and so I like that old-time baseball, and then just branched out into other topics that interest me. So in my spare time, I like to read and like to write.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly a fabulous teacher, and I really appreciate your bringing your Great American Criminal Series, Crimes series, Trials, Great American Criminal Trials series to Days at Dunrovi. And we all started with the Abe Lincoln's most famous criminal trial, which involved the Farmer's Almanac. And as a little background, let's start with Abe before this trial. Part of what we read was that he had been involved in something like 4,000 civil litigations, but only about a handful of criminal. Is that right?
Right. He was, by the time of this trial, which is in 1857, 1858, he'd been in Congress, he'd been a state legislator in Illinois, but now he's really found his mark in Springfield, Illinois, as an attorney. Probably Illinois' best known and maybe its best attorney for about 10 or 15 years, and did very well, and his family was growing. He did lots of civil stuff. He worked for the railroads. He worked for banks. But he had a different kind of a varied kind of a practice. He would travel around the circuit, they called it, and he liked to do that. So was very well known, at least in central Illinois and other places. He was so well thought of that sometimes judges would ask Lincoln to sit in for him on the bench and as an acting judge, and he also acted as a special prosecutor sometimes when the regular prosecutor had a conflict or was gone or was ill or whatever. And then Lincoln also took private clients, mostly, as you say, were civil clients, how he made his living. But he did a fair amount of criminal work, not necessarily because he liked to do it that much, but because he was well known and he was known for being thorough and did a good job. And you can read a lot about his entire practice. You can read about his all the cases that, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of transcripts or records of many of those cases, just the final results. But you can read about his practice, and some people devote their whole historical lives to just studying that portion, just like other people read about the war years or the assassination or one topic of Lincoln. So it's a topic that I really find interesting because he was young and he was about to springboard into the White House and all the great things that awaited him.
Yeah, and when I first took your class, I guess I hadn't wrapped my head around the time frame, because this particular trial, which involved a murder, and maybe I'll have you just describe it here in a moment, but this was just 7 years before his assassination.
Right.
And so it seemed like there was a compressed, when he elevated fast.
He did, and I think when you see photographs of Lincoln, of course, there was a famous photograph of Lincoln taken the day of the not guilty verdict in the Almanac trial, and then 7 years later, at the end of the war, before he was killed, it looks like 40 years have gone by, because, as you say, so much was compressed in that short period of time.
Yeah.
So many things had happened, and I think it's fair to say that in 1857-58, he's looking to get back into national politics. He's getting ready to debate Stephen Douglas in the race for Illinois senator in the summer of '58. He's going to lose, but he's going to get a national spotlight. It's going to be shown on him. And then, of course, he's going to be in the White House. So it's fair to say that as he's winding up his law practice, he's got his eye on bigger things. I don't think anybody had any idea that there was going to be a war that was going to split the country apart for 4 years and all the thousands of people were going to be killed and all those things. But he definitely was looking to get back into the spotlight on a national scale. And interesting, I think, he always said when his terms were over, his 8 years in Washington were over, he was going to come back to Springfield or maybe Chicago, and they were going to go right on practicing law. He said, marry, just as we always did, our same friends, the same career, and go back to life as we knew it. So we had no idea. He had no idea what was in store.
Yeah, and no one could have really.
No one could
Right.
have.
So he took this case because he had been friends of the parents of the man who was being tried.
Right.
Let's go over the case, and then I do also want to bring in the movie at some point. We all did watch the movie.
It's good.
We had a great time watching
Great.
the movie. Yeah, but why don't you give us the outline of the case, and then we can talk about some of the specifics of it.
Okay, so you're right. Lincoln, when he was a young man, and I'm talking about 18, 19, 20 years old, had just left his parents' home and had moved to this little town called New Salem, which is still there, a recreated little village, New Salem, and was kind of, in his words, he was a piece of floating driftwood. He's going to be a surveyor, he's going to work at the post office, he's going to be a clerk, he's going to be maybe a farmer or a blacksmith. He wasn't sure, and he was taken in by these folks, the Armstrongs. Jack Armstrong was the guy, sort of one of the town ruffians, sort of a bully, when young Abraham moved to New Salem, and they wrestled, that famous wrestling match. And, could the new guy in town beat the old guy? And they sort of wrestled to a draw, and then they became friends. They had a respect for each other. Jack was married to Hannah, and Hannah had, I think, 6 kids. And so Abe Lincoln then spent a lot of time at their place because he was friends with the family. They took him in. They cooked meals for him. He helped Jack on the farm. He said later he even rocked some of those kids in the cradle and helped them get to sleep in the nighttime. So they became good friends. And then if you fast forward about 23 or 24 years later, after he's been a legislator, he's now a successful lawyer. He's moved to Springfield, about 20 miles away from New Salem. And Jack and Hannah's son, William Armstrong, or Duff Armstrong, was the one who was charged with the murder. So the story is that there were actually two defendants, as you probably know, a guy named Norris and then Duff Armstrong. And after Norris was put on trial and found guilty,
almost immediately,
immediately,
what I could understand,
right, within a few days,
yeah.
Hannah and Jack were very worried what might happen to their son Duff. Jack was very ill, really almost literally on his deathbed. And the story, it's hard to verify if that's true or not, but he said, Hannah, you need to sell the farm if you have to, but talk to Mr. Lincoln. It's hard to say how much of that is true, but we do know that Hannah met with Lincoln in Springfield, and he agreed to take the case, not for a fee, but because he was so grateful for all the good friendship and fellowship they'd enjoyed almost 25 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. And so it was Hannah's son, and this was almost a year after the fact, right?
The summer of '57 was the incident,
right,
out at a place called Walker's Grove. Sometimes it's called Virgin Grove. And because of different legal maneuverings, the trial was I think the 1st of May of '58.
So almost a year later.
Almost.
Yeah. And this is where, I mean, the whole event had, if you start comparing what the movie said from what actually happened, major differences.
Big differences,
Big
right.
differences in the weapon, for example. In the movie, they showed a knife being involved, and in the trial, the slingshot seemed to have played a role in that. But my understanding was that Duff had sworn that all he did was punch him.
Right.
That it was a fisticuff, really, more than anything else. And did he not, the victim, he survived the attack that night and got on his horse, did he not?
He did.
And rode home.
Right. Some versions have him riding to a friend's house, and other versions have him riding home. But what is certain is that 2 days later he died.
At home.
At home, and the doctor had come to see him, and he died. And so I think he sort of drifted in and out, but the injuries were bad enough that he didn't make it. And some of those things you say are exactly true, and some of those things you say we think are true, and some of those things we're not sure at all. So, but in general, that's right. That's the story.
Well, I think you just touched upon the basis of our conversation online. Was it's really difficult to know what happened and even what happened at the trial. Isn't that correct?
It is. Unfortunately, there were no transcripts, or at least any that survived. So we have a little bit of newspaper account here and there, and we have the clerk of court's notes, which are usually called minute entries, sort of summaries. We have a jury instruction. We have then much later, 30 or 40 or even 50 years later, we have letters from, say, the judge, his recollections, or a juror, his recollection of what had happened at the trial. But we don't have any real good, solid contemporary accounts. We think we have a pretty good idea, but there's a lot of loose ends that we're not sure.
So walk us through the trial.
Okay.
And my understanding, it was a one-day trial. It
was a one-day trial. And, we recognize today, with our jurisprudential system is pretty familiar to a lot of us, and we recognize aspects of the trial back in those days, but some things were certainly different. So there were two defendants, and Norris was one, and Duff Armstrong was the second. Now there was this revival meeting, a camp meeting. That's where the incident took place, out in the woods, and you can go there today. I've been there, and it's mostly cornfields. But you can still see the brooks running by, and you still see some stands of trees, and you can stand in what was then Walker's Grove. And they had a camp meeting. It was a Methodist meeting. A pretty famous preacher by the name of James Cartwright had organized it. And they usually lasted about a week because most towns or villages on the prairie didn't have regular churches, much less ministers or pastors.
Right.
So they would kind of travel around. This guy, Peter Cartwright, was a famous circuit rider, and set up a tent. Now they had a state law that said you can't have gambling or alcohol or racing or any vice sort of thing within half a mile of the camp meeting. So naturally, within a half mile, that's exactly what they had. So they had horse races and they called them grocery stores, but really they were just little traveling bars, taverns, and horse racing and gambling.
And food, I assume.
And food, right.
Yeah.
And so you had the people going to the meeting, and then you had people going out to party, and sometimes people did both.
Yeah.
So that's where Duff was, and that's where Norris was, and that's where the victim was. All local guys, all in their 20s. Duff Armstrong was single. Norris was married, had a couple kids, and the victim, Press Metzger, had, I think, 4 kids. And they were all there. So the night in August when this took place, again, we can only go by sketchy accounts that came later, but evidently lots of alcohol, lots of whiskey, and there was words between those 3 guys to some degree or another. And then tempers flared, then they cooled off, and then it happened again. Now, supposedly Duff Armstrong had gone to sleep under a wagon when he was aroused by Metzger, but there was another fight, and this was about 11 o'clock at night, and witnessed by lots of people, but there was lots of alcohol too. So
And the time is really important here.
time is very important, but we're almost positive it was right around 11 p.m. And so it was dark, but there was some moonlight. But there were lots of trees, and it had been 2 or 3 or 4 days of solid partying in that area. And there was a fight, and Metzger was hit in the back, probably by a board or a club or something that came from a wagon. And he may or may not have been hit in the front by what they called a slung shot, which is like a slingshot, except for the shot doesn't get released. You think of David and Goliath, but that wasn't it.
Sort of a leather thong with something.
But the copper or the metal ball was encased in leather, so it never was released. So it was just struck.
Right.
So that was the second weapon, supposedly. And then you're exactly right. Metzger was hurt badly, got on his horse somehow, and either went home or to a friend's house. Within just, I think, even before Metzger died, 2 days later, there were warrants for the arrests of Norris and Armstrong, and the grand jury met right away, heard the testimony, and then, as you say, the Norris's trial was in just a few days or weeks of the incident, and for various reasons, Armstrong's trial was delayed.
Various reasons.
Right. One of the reasons is because the original firm that the Armstrongs hired, the local firm there in Havana, Illinois, for whatever reason dropped out, or she asked Lincoln to come on board, and he did. Then the prosecutor, a guy named Fullerton, moved to continue the case until the spring, and what we think happened is Lincoln agreed, even though his client was in custody, Lincoln agreed to move it to the spring if the venue could be changed, just like today, a change of venue, and that's why it was moved to Beardstown in Cass County, which is the couple counties over. So there was sort of a give and take, and he tried to get Duff out of jail, but the charges were too serious. He kept him in jail all winter long.
Yeah, I found that change of venue to be curious, because I certainly don't understand the law, but my understanding of change of venue is to accommodate a prejudicial jury within the local, too much knowledge within the local area, to try to get people who are not tainted by information. But was that the case here, or was it to accommodate other matters of the court?
No, I think that was actually mostly the case that they felt they couldn't get a trial. It was strategically probably a good move because Norris had been convicted just very quickly.
Right.
There didn't seem to be any doubt at all.
And he was sent up for manslaughter. Is that not correct?
Right. And manslaughter is what we often think of negligent homicide, or sometimes in some places, it's second degree or mitigated homicide. There are reasons which led to the death. Right. That's what you think of manslaughter, as opposed to deliberate homicide.
Right.
So manslaughter, and I'm sure the judge and the jury were thinking, and the prosecutor were thinking, well, there were 2 defendants. We're not sure who started the fight. We're not sure what the circumstances. There was alcohol. Who was the aggressor? but it didn't appear that Metzger had a weapon. So I think that manslaughter seemed to be a good compromise. Also, Norris had a prior charge, which he'd been acquitted of.
Right.
But I think the feeling was, well, we've got him this time. So it was a lesser charge and went up for, I think, 8 years. So that's exactly right. But because of all those factors, Lincoln was absolutely smart enough and savvy enough to say, we can't get a fair trial here in Havana. Too many things are against us. Judge, let's continue the trial till the spring, but let's move it as well. And that's not unlike what would happen today, a change of venue, because you can't get a fair pool of jurors to try that case.
And going back to the first defendant, or the convicted, did it not happen that as president he was pardoned by Lincoln?
He applied for a pardon, and I think it's a little blurry, but I think what happened is that he actually had, this is many years later,
Right.
and he applied for a pardon through the governor of Illinois, and the governor, through Lincoln's old law partner, William Herndon, or Billy Herndon, may have approached Lincoln. Lincoln didn't give him the pardon. But
I didn't think he would be able to, since it was a state law, not a federal.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But there was
A connection.
and that's a blurry part, but there was a connection there, and eventually he got that pardon, right?
Yeah. Okay, so just to string all this together, so Hannah's husband Jack dies,
Right.
and she does follow through and get a hold of Lincoln, and Lincoln gets a change of venue. So now we're in May of 1958, right?
That's right.
1858, pardon me, not
Right.
1958, 1858. And the jury and the trials has been changed. The venue has been changed. So now we're at the trial.
Right.
And so tell us. It seemed like the defense had a number of witnesses, and the state only had one. Is that correct?
That's not quite correct. The state essentially retried the Norris case.
Okay.
So they called a handful of so-called eyewitnesses, and then they called the doctor. The doctor, I think his name was Stevenson, who had examined the victim, Metzger. But what was very strange, probably the strangest thing in this whole scenario, is that the key eyewitness, who's a guy named Allen, couldn't be found for the second trial. The guy that had testified against Norris, by the light of the moon I saw, and I could clearly see and everything, he couldn't be found, and it took a modern, what we would now call a subpoena, to get him to appear in court. And you have to wonder why that was, because why was he reluctant to testify a second time? Was it because Lincoln was so well known? Was it because Lincoln was intimidating? Or was there some other reason that he didn't want to testify? We're not sure, but the sheriff deputy had to go out and get him. Lincoln certainly put on a much better defense for his client than Norris had received for his trial 7 or 8 months earlier.
Okay, so there's this key witness who was the eyewitness in both trials.
Yes, that's right.
And by my understanding is that, and I don't know, Lincoln must have read then the previous trial and the light of the moon. I mean, he came to trial with the almanac. He already had that defense figured up.
He did.
He did. And so he had to know that was going to be a part of what was going to be said. I mean, this is a one-day trial. You don't get to go home and get the almanac all of a sudden.
Right. No, that's right. That legend has it later he went to the drugstore on the eve of the trial. No, that wasn't true. He was prepared. But excuse me, what some people don't realize is there was really 2 or 3 branches or prongs to Lincoln's defense, and the moonlight was certainly one, and an important one. He was going to impeach Allen, the eyewitness, with that. But there were other things Lincoln also used that really were just as effective. It's just that the almanac and the moon was so dramatic that got all the attention, and still gets all the attention.
Okay, that's interesting. So he, and my understanding is that he then set him up for that testimony, that he asked him several times about the light, that was sort of an important aspect before he revealed the almanac, that he really got him to grip onto that, the moon aspect.
That's exactly right. Now, if you think about the timing of that cross-examination, this would be different than what happened today. So, 150 years ago, there's no rules of evidence necessarily like we now have that we have to follow. There are rules, but things were slightly different. And one thing that was different was Allen had already testified for the prosecution the first morning of the first day of the trial. And there was maybe a little cross-examination, but not much. But Allen then was still under subpoena, so Lincoln kept him at bay, so to speak. And in the afternoon, after Lincoln had called his witnesses, then he recalled Allen back to the stand and examined him directly as his witness rather than cross-examine him in the morning. And so he did that, was one of the last things that the jury heard before they went out to deliberate. And that's when they impeached him with the moonlight. And that's why it was so devastating to the state's case. So Lincoln took advantage of the looser rules that you could do back then.
In terms of the timing and when he brought that forward.
That's right. Today you would have to, the states calls their witnesses, you cross-examine them.
Right.
Maybe you get permission to call them back later, but ordinarily not. Lincoln took advantage of that and called him as a witness in his own right. And it was just, as I say, devastating to the state's case.
So I did some quite a bit of reading on this. I had fun with this.
That's good. That's good.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I did the Illinois State Historical Society, Lincoln's Defense of Duff Armstrong, and in several accounts here, I read that first of all that Lincoln was very eloquent, and that part of his defense, in fact, was his knowledge of the family and his trust and love of the family.
Right.
And he really moved the jurors to sort of put Duff in the context of this larger family that he knew so well. And he brought that, I mean, in my mind, that would be totally inappropriate in a trial today.
But you wouldn't get away with that. But that was the third branch of Lincoln's attack.
Okay.
So if I could. So
yes,
the first
absolutely.
one.
Yes.
Excuse me. The first one was Lincoln called his own doctor, his own physician, contrary to what the state's physician had testified. The state's physician said, yep, there were injury to the back of the head and then out the front, implying that there were two separate weapons, two different blows to the head. Lincoln had his doctor testify that both injuries could have been caused by one shot and one, not a rifle shot, but one blow to the head with the same instrument, leaving them to think maybe Norris, the first defendant, had inflicted both injuries and Duff Armstrong hadn't done anything. Or at the very worst, Duff Armstrong just used his fists, which wouldn't have been enough to kill a man. So that was the first thing, medical. The second thing, of course, was the scientific, or the almanac. And that is Lincoln impeaching the state's key witness who didn't want to testify at the second trial, and then Lincoln impeaching him horribly and getting him, the jury at least, to believe that he couldn't have seen what he said because the moon was not nearly as bright and was setting. And then the third one, as you say, was Lincoln's emotional plea or appeal to the jury. And you read those accounts where supposedly Lincoln had a tear and the jury had a tear. Well, we don't know about that, but evidently the judge let that go. And even before he died, when Duff Armstrong himself wrote his version of the offense and of the trial, he also mentioned that. So I think there was some of that. So Lincoln played that emotional card as his third prong of the defense, and all three were successful.
Wow. So this really does tell you a lot about his strategy and the way he approached a legal situation, didn't it?
And what's funny about that is Lincoln had some of his notes survive from other trials, and there was another case where he represented a family of a Revolutionary War veteran, and his notes for his closing argument are all that we know about it. And Lincoln writes down exactly, mentioned Revolutionary War, he was a veteran, he served his country, his poor family sacrificed, and then skin him with the emotional stuff. Those are in Lincoln's words, and that's all he needed as an outline for a closing argument, and that's how he won that case. I can imagine he did the same sort of thing here as he defended his friend Duff.
Wow. That's pretty stirring stuff, isn't it?
That's why we love Lincoln so much. We're always amazed at what this guy could come up with.
Yeah. So the jury comes back almost immediately, doesn't? It's
within the hour.
Within the hour.
Yeah. So you think, it took a day or two to select a jury,
right,
and worry about the jury instructions and get the witnesses and subpoenas lined up.
Right.
They tried this case in a day, a homicide case in a day. They only had maybe 15 witnesses altogether, and then the jury deliberated, and by sundown, Duff Armstrong was a free man.
Pretty amazing. Very, very interesting. So Lincoln goes on from there to the senatorial debate. He loses the election.
Right.
Becomes famous because of that. And the next thing we know, he's swept up into history as a...
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And one of the cool things about the Almanac trial is when you go to Illinois, of course you go to Springfield, where he lived with Mary and the kids, and that's the presidential library and the museum. It's terrific. And then half hour outside of town is the New Salem Recreated Village, and just an hour or so up the road from that is Beardstown, where the trial took place. It's only and that courtroom is still used as a city hall. And I've stood there, and what a feeling it is to stand in this courtroom and look at where the judge sat and where Lincoln sat and where the jury sat, and you just take it in and you think about the greatest president we've ever had. So it's one of the 2 courthouses that are still in existence where Lincoln practiced law, and it turns out really his greatest case, fittingly, is one of those that still stands. So if you ever get a chance to get to central Illinois, make sure you go to Beardstown.
Oh, you've sparked my interest. I think
That's good.
Exactly, I want to go. So tell us something about the historical digging. I mean, that was really clear. When you just showed up here a little while ago, you said that some things are getting less clear.
Right.
And so this is an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing dig
in
history.
It is, and you'd think, particularly say, excuse me, with the moonlight, you think,
Right.
well, that should be pretty easy.
Right.
And it's way more complicated than you think. But I think that actually is part of the reason for the confusion, because this trial was in 58. In 1909, that was the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. So there were nationwide celebrations, and lots of statues were put up, and that's what led to this sort of thing. Those writings, and
Yes.
the Illinois Ladies Society and the Civil War Veterans Society. So, excuse me, as they tried to talk about all the facets of Lincoln's life, but in particular this trial, and then they dug and they realized this moonlight thing is really complicated. So rather than go through all the meridian and the sunset and the high moon and the low rise and everything else, I think a lot of people said, it's too complicated, we can make it easier. Let's just say that Lincoln said there was no moon at all that night, so he had to have been making it up, and it was a great thing, and we'll call it good. And of course, that's not what happened. But even if you read today in scientific journals, or journals where they're talking about the sky and the stars and all that stuff, it's way beyond me. Very confusing, and very hard to determine what happened. But what we think we know is that Allen, the eyewitness, said the sun was about like it was, or the moon was about where the sun was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So the moon was high above the trees. Remember, it was a grove, shining brightly. What we do know from the almanac is that the moon was going to, the top edge of the moon, remember the moon is round, so the top edge is going to sink last. So there's still going to be slivers of light, but it's going to be shining through the trees now. So a little bit of light, and that was probably about 10 to 12, between 10 to 12 midnight, and maybe as late as 3 minutes after midnight when it's finally set. And it's all this celestial stuff is way beyond me, but you can read about it if you go to the scientific journals, and it's I think part of the myth is it's just easier to say, well, there was no moon that night and the almanac proved it, but that's not really true. So we're still learning a lot of things. And you know what? Just like they discover, every once in a while they'll discover a new Lincoln photograph that they never saw, or a new version of a speech he gave, or a letter that he wrote. Maybe someday we'll find a trial transcript or another letter or something about this trial, and we'll get some more answers.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like there was a time when people said that he had altered the almanac, and he brought an altered almanac to the. I mean, there was all these red herrings that.
Yeah, and if you think about it, if the simplified myth is that Lincoln claimed there was no moon that night, it would be easy to find an almanac that, of course, proved that there was.
Right.
So if you go by the myth, well, Lincoln lied to the jury.
Right.
But that's not true. So he didn't say there was no moon that night.
Right.
He just said the light was so diminished he couldn't see. It was really interesting, and it's funny. I've been reading and studying about Lincoln really my whole life, but the prairie years the young lawyer years are my favorite. I'd rather read about that than about the Civil War. I'm happy to read all of it, but that's something about Lincoln as a young man and as an attorney that really fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, this is an incredibly fascinating trial, and I also wonder, would it have taken on this kind of significance had Lincoln not become the president? I mean, it seemed like there was a after his death is when people started looking back and started digging,
Right.
because it became that myth sort of grew.
That is right, and we forget about the fact that during those short 4 or 5 years of his presidency, he was really unpopular in a lot of places, and there was no guarantee he was going to get reelected in '64.
Right.
There was fighting within his party, and naturally the folks down south, the Confederacy couldn't, so he wasn't, he didn't become the heroic mythical figure until afterwards, and certainly the assassination played a part of that. So every time we find a different corner or different aspect of Lincoln's life that we can look at, we tend to look at it through that lens or that prism of, well, Lincoln was perfect and he was the emancipator, but of course he wasn't perfect.
Right.
And he wasn't extremely popular in his lifetime, certainly like he is now, but it makes the figure so much more fascinating.
Oh yeah, human.
He does.
Totally human.
Right.
Well, we're ready for some questions here.
good.
If anybody is wanting to ask a question, people hated him. Use the comments on YouTube page.
Yeah.
Let's see. They still hate him. Yeah.
Some people do.
Some people still do.
They do.
Exactly
It's funny
right.
if you travel in the South much, if you talk to people that are interested in history, though, it's usually General Sherman or Grant that
Right.
they dislike more than Lincoln. Although there's lots of anti-Lincoln stuff too. That's for
Right.
sure.
Yeah. Well, very controversial. A controversial part of our history that that echoes constantly.
It does.
It's one that we really haven't. I mean, we're fighting it again today, aren't we?
We are, and I think we wish all of our leaders, every generation, looks to Lincoln and say, "Boy, I wish we had leaders like that." But that overlooks the fact that Lincoln wasn't universally loved during his lifetime.
So I have a comment from somebody who said that they had read the book Killing Lincoln and realized that on the night of his assassination there were a group of murders that night and several other attempted assassinations. Is that correct?
Well, that's partly correct. There was, the night that Lincoln was killed, there were supposed to be 2 other murders, but neither one of them were successful. The first was the vice president was supposed to be killed, Andrew Johnson. He lived at the First National Hotel in D.C., which happened to be the same hotel where John Wilkes Booth stayed. One of Booth's accomplices was supposed to assassinate Johnson that night, but he got drunk and chickened out. And so Johnson was spared. But the Secretary of State, William Seward, who lived in a mansion kitty corner from the White House, now gone, was attacked that night by a guy named, also one of Booth's accomplices, by a guy named Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne, he went by sometime, and he survived. So there were supposed to have been 3 homicides the night that Lincoln was killed, and 1 out of 3 was actually carried out.
And it was a conspiracy that Booth was part of.
Booth was the leader of that conspiracy for all those crimes. The idea was to throw the government into chaos. And originally Booth thought he would kidnap Lincoln, take him to the South, and exchange the live Lincoln for the release of all the Confederate prisoners, and then it would start the war up again. That wasn't going to happen after Lee surrendered, so Booth thought he would kill Lincoln, throw the entire federal government into chaos by all these 3 killings.
And reopen the war.
And then Booth would be seen as a hero, and of course none of that happened.
Interesting.
Hero in the
Very
South,
interesting.
I should say, yeah.
Huh. Anne Rutledge, who is
Yeah.
and who is Anne?
That is a great question. I'm glad you mentioned that, because if I could,
Well, I didn't.
well,
one of our
that's great.
viewers did.
Anne is great. I want to mention this book. I don't know if some of you folks read this book or not.
Well, we read about it.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So this book, which is called Moonlight, by a guy named John Evangelist Walsh.
Right.
Now, Walsh has been around a long time, and he likes to write historical fiction. They're sort of easy to read, and topics that interested him. This particular book, Moonlight, he wanted it to be the definitive almanac trial, and it didn't. It's not seen as that. You might have read some reviews that aren't very kind. But so
Right
from
here.
Michigan or somewhere,
Yes.
yeah. So there's a lot. He takes a lot of license, but in Mr. Walsh's defense, to get to the question,
Right.
he wrote a book prior to this one I think it's called The Moon Rises or something like that. And it's the story, his version of the love story, the romance of Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge. And that book was well received. I think, though, that book was well received because lots of people, including myself, really like to believe that Lincoln was in love with another young lady named Anne Rutledge, and she did die, and it did break his heart, and she did really never get over him, even though or he never got over her, even though he married Mary, and all that, the drama that came later. But you can visit Anne Rutledge's grave, of course, in the movie that you saw. You know, Henry Fonda goes out to the grave site, and that's Anne, and she was also made famous by some poetry. Sandberg and other folks who wrote poetry about Anne Rutledge. But Walsh wrote a book about that, which I do recommend, about that, which is a kind of a pleasure to read, because I think we like to believe, yeah, that sounds like that would be Lincoln. That explains a lot, all the melancholy, all the heartbreak, and so we like to think that that's maybe true. So, and she was, again, someone that Lincoln knew from his New Salem days, at the same time that he knew the Armstrongs.
So I want to touch on this. One of the confusing things that I found in going online and looking at all of these different sources were a lot of these had what I felt credible sources.
Mm-hmm.
This was from an association of the Lincoln, what is it? The Lincoln Foundation or something of that nature. And they just took poor Walsh to task.
They did.
Yeah, I mean, they really, really, and I thought, oh boy, this is really interesting. There's such a controversy here, and then when you go to some place like, here's another one that I found. I just thought this was so interesting that there was still such. Here's one from the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody's got an opinion. It seemed like
Everyone does. You know, it's really funny that Lincoln is such a figure in our national consciousness that there are groups that are actually.
Let me hold the book here.
Yeah.
People want to know the book.
There are Lincoln groups out there that actually don't get along, and so they're comprised of Lincoln scholars and historians and just readers and history lovers and fans. For example, there's a Lincoln Association, and there's the Lincoln Forum, and there's the Cleveland Roundtable, which is Civil War Roundtable, which is a very well-respected group. They all have boards of directors, and they all have officers, and they all meet, and they all give Lincoln prizes, and they all give Lincoln awards, and the members don't particularly like each other.
Isn't that interesting?
And that's exactly right. So, and I'll tell you a good example. And this almanac trial is a good example of how different groups view things differently. And you probably might be a member of the Lincoln Association, but that means you're not a member of the Lincoln Forum, or vice versa. And a good example of, many of us saw the Spielberg movie Lincoln a few years ago, which did so well.
Yes.
And the two folks from each group were really competing with each other to see who could be advisors to Spielberg on the film. And not everybody can be an advisor on a Lincoln movie, but those are the sorts of things that they argue about. I think there's really good men and women on both sides. I've had the pleasure over the years to meet lots and lots of them. But they can take a topic like a trial, or Anne Rutledge, or whether he really loved Mary, or the assassination, and come at it from different points of view, and they do battle historically.
It's really fascinating to those of us who are not historians that, you know, that when you say that Welch tried to do the definitive.
He tried to.
And for everybody, it's Abraham Lincoln and the Almanac Trial, Moonlight by John Evangelist Walsh, W-A-L-S-H. And I will post this online so everybody has a reference that they can go and read that. But it really did show to those of us who are not historians how very complex and how convoluted and how difficult it is when you're looking back at something that's this important, and yet there's still all of this confusion and continued information arises and percolates.
Yep, and we
through
can't
time.
get when we can't get enough. I don't know how many Lincoln books are published every year, but it's dozens of them every year.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough as a writer to find a little corner or something that might be of interest, you can get it published and get it read and get a critique, and then there's always more stuff coming up.
That's great. Well, do we have any more questions? Did Mary really have the emotional problems portrayed in the movie Lincoln?
Yeah, there's no question Mary had emotional problems. There's no doubt about that. For so many things in that lady's life that went so well for her. She was from a wealthy family. All the young men in New Salem liked her. Many of them wanted to marry her. She makes it to the White House. She's the first lady. For all those unbelievable things, she had such tragedy. Her mom died. She didn't get along with her stepmother. She had step brothers who fought for the South while her husband's president of the Union. She lost 3 sons. She lost her husband, of course, literally next to her at Ford's Theater. Her surviving son eventually has her committed to an asylum or institution in Chicago for a whole year. How much more horrible things could happen to poor Mary? So did she have mental health problems? She absolutely did. Now, I also have to say there, though, that I'm in the camp that believes that Lincoln and Mary were definitely in love, and they loved each other. And I think Lincoln put up with a lot of the silliness, and he was away for a long time as he rode the law circuit. I'm kind of in that group, that camp. But if we can believe accounts from Lincoln's friends and neighbors, she was not a particularly nice lady to get along with all the time in Springfield, Illinois. But then again, she had issues a lot of us never had to face. So I like to give Mary a little bit of a break. But I think, yes, the things sometimes we see in films and other popular culture there's something to it.
Well, you're making me want to read about her and have you come back and discuss it.
The best biography of Mary Lincoln is by an author named Jean Baker.
Jean Baker.
Jean Baker. And
Jane or Jean?
Jean with a J.
Jean.
And she is solidly in the pro Mary Todd Lincoln camp that I guess I'm in. But then again, the things she went through, none of us have had to go through. So.
Well, do we have any other questions out there? This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, it's my great pleasure.
Really been fun. We'll give them another second or two.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's a little delay.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, right. Well, I see we have somebody typing here.
I don't think Mary was in the Henry Fonda movie,
No,
though, was she?
no.
They didn't have anybody portray
The
her.
Henry Fonda movie was way fun.
Oh.
Way fun. But if you'd read anything before, you saw all of these issues that they sort of put a lot into one movie, didn't they?
It was like a caricature of these bizarre witnesses and scrub white and all these people with the plaid pants, and they, and the judge and the lawyers can talk whenever they want to, so they turned it into, but it sort of rollicks along.
Right.
But Henry Fonda, he just almost always nails it seems like, in his career, so I'm glad he had a chance to.
He even looked Lincoln-esque, didn't he?
He did. What's interesting, too, is the Spielberg movie that we were talking about. Well, that was...
Annette Dreyfuss. What's his name?
The guy that played Lincoln?
Yes.
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Daniel Day-Lewis.
So, and he won the award, and it was terrific. He's not 6'4", but that's
Right.
okay and everything. He wasn't Spielberg's first choice. The first choice to play Lincoln in that movie was Liam. I forget his last name.
Neon.
That's right.
Liam Nelson or Neon.
Yeah, Nielsen or something like
That's
that.
right.
Who you know from the other action movies. He's
Right,
a terrific actor
right,
too.
right.
In fact,
Irish guy.
right. In fact, he was there just a week before I was one summer in Springfield, and I asked the people at the library what he was doing there. And they said, well, he's preparing for the role. He's going to play Lincoln. And he was just reading as much as he could. Then that fell through, and then Daniel Lewis came on board and did a terrific job. So
He did do.
things
Very
happen.
interesting. Right.
Well,
Well, everybody enjoyed this.
Oh, great.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry.
My great pleasure.
Okay, and we'll have you back in 2 weeks.
I'll be here.
Well, we'll be talking about Lizzie Borden.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, she's going to be an interesting read as well, isn't she?
We should have talked about Lizzie Borden on Halloween because that'll spook everybody. So we'll do it. I'll be
That's
here.
good. That's great. That's wonderful. Well, we're going to say goodbye then to everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our learning adventure with Larry Manch, and we'll see you 2 weeks from today at the same time. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. This is going to work, Larry.
Is it?
Yeah.
All those people are they just writing in saying,
Yeah.
saying we're with
right.
you or we're
Yeah.
hearing you or whatever they're saying? Huh?
Yeah, they just